The ridge wasn't supposed to move. It had stood unchanged for centuries, until the ground shook, the summit cracked open, and an entire section of the mountain began collapsing straight into the valley below. Every aircraft pulled away, except one, low-flying A-10. You're watching Warthog Valor Stories. Before we dive in, where in the world are you watching from tonight? Major Ember Calloway had flown through turbulence, sandstorms, and electronic warfare zones, but nothing prepared her for the moment the mountain itself began to break. She was running a low-altitude training pass along the western ridge, cruising just above the tree line when her altimeter flickered and the entire horizon seemed to shift. At first, she thought it was an instrument glitch. Then the ridgeline rippled, actually rippled, like a fabric being shaken from underneath. A heartbeat later, the first fracture tore across the summit. A plume of dust erupted upward, scattering in the wind before falling back in dense sheets. The mountain groaned with a low, grinding roar that vibrated through her cockpit. Ember banked left for a clearer view, and her breath caught. A massive section of granite was detaching from the peak, sliding forward as if the mountain had been kicked from behind. Instinct flared. She pushed the hog lower, searching for any signs of people or vehicles below. 2 maintenance trucks were parked near a service path on the valley floor, far too close to the fall zone. They hadn't moved. They might not even know the ridge was coming down. Ember keyed her mic. "Valley crew, this is A-10 inbound. The ridge is collapsing. Evacuate immediately." Static answered her, a bad sign. If the rock slide had already severed the comms repeater, they were completely cut off. She dropped to treetop height, throttling forward as the ridge above her shattered in stages, first boulders, then slabs, then an entire wall of stone cascading like an avalanche. Dust filled the air, her canopy iced with grit. She blinked and steadied her breathing. She had flown into worse, but never beneath a mountain that was actively falling. She spotted the trucks again through the haze, doors open, tools scattered, but no sign of movement. The valley crew had frozen, overwhelmed by the shockwave, or worse, trapped behind debris. If she didn't reach them before the next fracture hit, the collapse would bury the entire valley. Ember nosed the hog even lower, wings slicing through powdery dust as the ground trembled beneath her. The collapsing ridge gave off another deep rumble, louder this time, closer. A shadow rolled across the valley floor, long and jagged and growing fast. She looked up. A slab the size of a building had broken free from the summit and was accelerating downward, angling directly toward her flight path. And she realized she had only one way out, straight under the falling mountain before it slammed into the valley. Ember pushed the throttles to full, the hog dropping so close to the valley floor that dust trailed behind her like a wake. Above her, the entire ridge was coming apart, not in scattered pieces, but in massive, accelerating slabs of stone. Each fracture echoed through the valley like thunder trapped in a canyon. She'd flown low before, but never through a sky that was literally falling. The first slab split mid-air, breaking into spinning chunks that whistled past her canopy. One hit the ground behind her, exploding in a plume of dirt that shook the hog's tail. Ember kept her hand steady. The A-10 wasn't fast, but it could survive hits no other jet would dare take, and today that durability was all she had. Ahead, the 2 maintenance trucks finally came into view again. One lay on its side, crushed by debris. The other was upright, but abandoned. Fresh footprints scattered in the dust, leading toward a narrow incline along the ridge wall. The valley crew had run for their lives, but the collapse was faster. Another crack ripped across the summit. Ember looked up just long enough to see an even larger section of the mountain shearing away, It wasn't a rock slide anymore. It was a full structural failure, an entire shelf of the ridge folding forward like a breaking wave. She keyed her mic again, knowing no one could hear her. "Valley crew, if you're moving, keep moving." A shockwave hit the hog as the next chunk of the ridge fell, slamming her sideways. Dust burst across the canopy. Alarms chirped. She corrected, dipped lower, and shot between two swirling dust pillars, just as the first slab slammed into the valley floor behind her. The impact hit like a bomb. Air compressed. The ground trembled. A rolling wall of debris surged outward in a brown tidal wave. Ember felt the blast push her upward and fought the stick back down. She scanned quickly for the workers and saw them, two small figures scrambling toward a shallow rock overhang. If they made it there, they might survive the dust wave, but the collapse itself would bury the entire pocket in less than 30 seconds. A second fracture tore open higher on the ridge, deeper, longer, and angling straight toward the worker's position. Ember's stomach dropped. This wasn't survivable without help. She checked her altitude, her angle, the slope of the falling stone. One insane idea formed instantly. If she flew into the debris line, low enough, fast enough, the hog's wake turbulence might disrupt the downward flow for a few seconds, just long enough for the workers to duck beneath the overhang before the mountain crushed it. It was reckless. It was nearly suicidal. But it was the only play left. She tightened her straps, pulled in a sharp breath, and committed. The hog climbed slightly, then dove toward the collapsing ridge, slicing into the dust cloud as boulders thundered past. If she misjudged the line by even a meter, the mountain would rip the hog out of the sky. A shape spun out of the dust ahead, a boulder the size of her nose cone, tumbling directly into her flight path. And Ember had less than a second to choose. Pull up and lose the workers, or punch through and risk everything. Ember didn't pull up. Pulling up meant abandoning the workers, and every instinct she had rejected that option. Instead, she dipped the left wing, let gravity pull the hog into a controlled skid, and slid beneath the spinning boulder with inches to spare. Stone scraped the upper fuselage with a metallic scream, but the hog stayed airborne. Dust swallowed her. Visibility dropped to zero. Her cockpit jolted with every shockwave as the ridge continued collapsing overhead. She flew purely on instinct now, reading the tremors in the air, the tilting of the ground below, the brief flickers of light through the dust. The hog vibrated harder as the pressure around her changed, the airflow tightening. That meant the main collapse was close, too close. She forced the aircraft lower until the landing gear warning wailed again. Trees were somewhere ahead. She could smell the shredded pine through the vents, but in this haze, anything could be a fatal obstacle. She kept her hand steady, nudging the hog through the choking brown fog while the mountain roared like a living thing behind her. A sudden break in the dust revealed the valley crew. Two workers, clinging to the ridge pocket, waving frantically as debris crashed down around them. Ember angled the hog upward just enough to draw a wake, flipping the airflow in a tight spiral. The turbulence struck the falling debris, scattering the smaller fragments and slowing the slide just slightly. It wasn't much, but it bought the workers the seconds they needed to squeeze under the overhang. The ridge behind her gave a deep, resonant crack, the kind that meant the next stage of the collapse was moments away. Ember pulled the hog up and away from the slope, just as an avalanche of stone erupted across the valley floor, swallowing the trucks below and sending a wave of dust rolling across the basin. She coughed, wiped grit from her visor, and circled back toward the worker's position. The overhang was still intact, somehow. Dust billowed from its edges, and fallen stones piled around it, but the pocket hadn't been crushed completely. She positioned the hog for another low pass to check their status. Two figures emerged from the dust, staggering but alive, waving both arms at her. Relief hit her hard, just for a moment. Then her comms flickered. A strange distortion cut through the static. Not natural, not seismic. It was a digital interference pattern, sharp and repeating, like a coded ping bouncing off the ridge walls. Ember frowned and lifted her visor slightly. No collapse could produce a signal like that, and no natural rock formation would reflect it with such precision. She banked right, scanning the debris field again. Something glinted through the dust, a metallic edge too straight and too polished to be natural stone. Then another glint, then a shape. Her stomach tightened. A structure was emerging from beneath the fallen ridge, angled metal beams forced upward by the collapse, revealing the top of something buried beneath the mountain. Something square, reinforced, man-made. The collapse wasn't just geological. It had exposed something. Ember dropped lower for a better look, but the dust was too thick. Her sensors struggled. The interference pulse grew stronger, repeating in intervals, almost rhythmic, not random, intentional. Whatever was hidden under the ridge wasn't just reflecting the collapse, it was responding to it. As she turned for another pass, the ground shifted again, but this time not from falling rock. The buried structure moved, and as the dust cleared for a split second, Ember saw a massive steel hatch forcing its way upward, as if something underneath the mountain was trying to break its way out. The hatch didn't rise at once. It shuddered, slow, uneven, as if fighting against decades of stone packed onto its surface. Ember held position above the swirling dust, watching the steel slab jolt upward in short, violent pulses. Every movement sent rubble sliding off its edges, revealing more of the buried structure beneath the ridge. This was no bunker entrance. It was too large, too reinforced, too deliberate. The interference pulse in her headset repeated again, sharper this time. A transmission was bouncing off the walls of the valley, tight band, encrypted, and old. Not military, not civilian, something in between. Ember adjusted her altitude for a clearer look, but the air was thick with pulverized rock. Her instruments complained. Her visibility hovered between bad and worse. Still, she circled lower. The dust thinned for a moment, enough to see the shape clearly. A massive steel door, 20 meters long, was rising from a hidden cavity beneath the ridge. The edges were lined with hydraulic pistons the size of tree trunks, some half bent from the collapse, others still straining upward with grinding metallic groans. The structure looked like it had slept under the mountain for decades, and the landslide had accidentally woken it up. "What the hell are you?" Ember muttered under her breath. She made another pass, angling the hog sideways. The steel surface bore no military markings, no insignia, no color coding, just dull gray plating scarred by the pressure of the collapse. The strange signals kept pulsing through her headset, steady, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. If the workers survived long enough to see this, they'd spread the rumor in minutes. If command caught wind of it, they'd shut down the entire valley. Whatever this thing was, it wasn't meant to be found. A sudden blast of air pressure rocked the hog sideways. Ember steadied her grip. The hatch had stopped rising. For a second, she thought the system had failed. Then she saw it. A seam forming. A horizontal divide across the steel surface. A faint line of light pushing outward. Not natural light. Artificial and deep. The hatch was opening. Ember banked harder, pulling the hog into a wide arc. Dust billowed upward again as an inner door split along the seam. What emerged wasn't a vehicle, or personnel, or equipment. It was a platform. A wide, reinforced elevator-like platform
rising from the hidden cavity, driven by machinery struggling under the weight of the collapse. Ember squinted as more of it emerged. Then she froze. Mounted at its center was a massive device, angular, armored, and aimed skyward. Not a gun turret, not radar. Something bulkier, with a rotating housing and a front aperture large enough to swallow a missile canister. The machinery whined as it lifted, powering back to life after who knew how many years. "This is not a landslide site anymore," Ember whispered. "This is a weapons installation." The interference pulse shifted tone. It wasn't static. It was targeting calibration. Someone or something inside the system was testing tracking routines. The platform finished rising. The housing rotated. The aperture locked on to the nearest moving object in the sky. Her. The beam wasn't a missile trail. It wasn't a tracer. It was a line of pure light, condensed, thin as wire, bright as welding arc, and so precise that Ember felt her skin prickle even from inside the cockpit. It sliced through the air behind her, steering with unnatural smoothness as the hidden platform tracked her climb. No known ground system moved like that. No conventional weapon locked on that fast. Whatever this installation was, it belonged to a different era, or a different doctrine entirely. The hog shuddered as Ember pushed it into a hard right bank. Dust from the collapse still swirled beneath her, creating a hazy curtain that made altitude changes unpredictable. The beam followed her shift instantly, tracing her path through the air like a needle-dragging thread. She dove. The air around her howled as she cut back toward the valley floor, wings trembling under the strain. The beam struck a boulder on the ridge and carved through it like butter, splitting it into two glowing halves. Ember gritted her teeth and leveled out, flying barely a handful of meters above the ground as the beam swept overhead, burning a narrow trail through the cliff face. She glanced down. The workers were still sheltered under the overhang, staring at the ridge in mute terror. Good. They were safe. For now.
Ember pulled the hog into a shallow climb, trying to force the beam to overshoot. Instead, it adjusted smoothly and kept tracking her. The platform wasn't firing bursts, it wasn't testing, it was learning, refining its aim, adjusting its velocity in micro-corrections that suggested automated intelligence paired with old hardware. A legacy system built for something far more dangerous than mountain avalanches. The pulse in her headset changed pitch again, sharper, tighter, a targeting lock. "Too close," Ember hissed. She rolled left and dropped into the dust cloud that still churned below. The beam stabbed into the haze, cutting spirals of glowing vapor as it hunted her signal. Ember slapped her countermeasure panel. Not flares, not chaff, but a pulse disruptor designed for mid-tier SAM systems. It fired, sending out a burst of interference that might confuse anything built after the Cold War. The beam flickered. Just for a heartbeat, but enough. Ember yanked the stick back, shooting upward through the dust like a slingshot stone. She burst into open air, sunlight slicing across her canopy. The beam followed slower this time, stuttering as the disruptor pulse scrambled the targeting sweep. But the delay lasted only seconds. Then the pitch in her headset rose again. The platform had recovered. Ember didn't know how much more the hog could take. Light weapons weren't supposed to generate concussive force, but she felt vibrations through the fuselage, static charge, electromagnetic interference, something unfamiliar. The hog wasn't built to fight lasers. Nothing in her training covered this, but she knew terrain, knew ridges, knew how to break line of sight. She banked sharply toward the narrow remains of a side chute, an angled gap barely wide enough for her wings. The beam slashed behind her, missing by inches, vaporizing a spray of dirt and stone. Ember held her breath as she dove into the chute, the wings clearing the rock by a margin so thin she could hear gravel scrape the fuselage.
The beam hit the canyon wall and skittered upward, losing its angle. Ember punched through the exit, shot across the lower ridge, and finally, broke visual contact with the platform. Her hands shook from the adrenaline, her instruments flickered with static, but she was alive. The beam didn't fire again. Not yet. Below her, the ridge groaned, a deep, grinding moan as the collapse continued. The hidden structure was now fully exposed, its platform still glowing, its weapon still tracking. The dust cleared enough for Ember to see its full shape for the first time. It wasn't a turret, it was a launch cradle, and something was beginning to rise from inside it. Whatever the beam was, it wasn't the real weapon. Ember circled for a better look, only to see massive steel clamps unlocking around a cylindrical object. And as the cradle opened, a towering missile, far larger than anything she'd seen outside classified files, began lifting into firing position, aimed directly at the sky. Whatever the ridge had been hiding wasn't dormant anymore, and it had already identified the hog as a threat.
Ember shoved the throttle forward, climbing fast as the weapon's faceplate realigned, adjusting for elevation. And as she cleared the ridgeline, a needle-thin beam of light fired from the platform, narrow, silent, and tracking her A-10 with chilling precision. The steel clamps released with a harsh metallic crack, and the cylindrical shape rising from the cradle became unmistakable. This wasn't debris or an abandoned relic. It was a fully intact long-range missile, sealed under the ridge and now awakening, as if the collapse itself had triggered it. Dust slid off its plating, revealing clean, matte metal and guidance fins that unfolded with unnerving precision. Ember's stomach tightened. If that missile launched, the entire valley and anything beyond it was in danger. She banked low. The cradle was armored on 3 sides, leaving only the top exposed. A direct GAU-8 run would do nothing, but the support drives beneath the platform, the machinery lifting the missile, were vulnerable. If she could hit those, maybe the cradle would collapse back into the cavity. The missile rose higher, humming as internal coils charged. Ember dropped to ground level, lining up a shallow strafing run. She fired. Tungsten rounds ripped into the exposed hydraulics with a shower of sparks. One of the lifts buckled, sending the platform tilting. Not enough. The cradle compensated immediately, stabilizing itself with backup systems she hadn't seen. The ignition whine grew louder. The missile glowed at its seams, seconds from firing. Ember swung wide for one final angle and spotted it. A narrow gap directly beneath the missile's core. Barely a few meters wide, just enough for a suicidal run. But it was the only shot that could destroy the last functioning support. She leveled the hog, breath steadying as she lined up with the slit of space beneath the rising weapon. Dust curled behind her. The workers huddled under the overhang, staring at the towering shape, helpless to do anything but trust her. If she missed by even a meter, she'd hit the missile or the rock wall and never make it out. Ember pushed the throttles. The hog lunged forward, engines howling, slicing toward the narrow gap just as the missile's ignition sequence peaked. A blinding plume of fire erupted from the missile's base, and Ember dove straight into the heat column, the only path left to stop the launch.